Welcome to another episode of Power Core Productions and Podcastings. I'm your host, Jerron Harrington, back to hit you another video. And today, we're going to be doing What If Deku Was a Power Ranger, Part 1. First and foremost, as always, I want to thank everyone who is a part of Power Core Productions and Podcastings. And always remember to like, comment, subscribe, share, and hit that bell for post notifications so you can stay up to date on everything that is Power Core Productions and Podcastings. Also, as far as the uploading schedule is going to concern everyone, we are going to be doing things in a little more of a different way to help pick up the pace, as I'm finally getting a good schedule and I'm getting into a good groove. So this is what the schedule is going to look like for the remaining week and going into next week. Because I have some free time tomorrow, I'm deciding to do something that I think you guys might like. That being that you're going to get 2 videos tomorrow. First and foremost, at midnight tonight, you're going to be getting What If Tanjiro Had Venom Part 3. That is going to be coming out at midnight tonight. And then tomorrow afternoon, you're going to get What If Deku Was a Power Ranger Part 2. So those will be the videos that will come out for Saturday. Sunday, I'm going to be off. And then next week is when we'll get into our official flow. That being on Monday, you will get the What If Tanjiro Had Venom series. And then on Tuesday, you'll get What If Deku Was a Power Ranger. And those days will alternate all the way up until Saturday. So Monday, Wednesday, and Friday will be What If Tanjiro Had Venom, and on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, we'll be doing What If Deku Was a Power Ranger, and those will be the series that we cover going forward. I'm going to be running 2 stories on alternate days, and Sunday is going to be the day that I'm off. Also, please vote down in the comment section below for what characters you think should inherit a role in this series. Now, there are 2 roles that need to be inherited. I think we've already established who's going to be what ranger in the Deku Power Ranger series, but the one ranger that has not been selected is the White Ranger. So I will have candidates for the White Ranger down below, and you guys can decide who gets to be the White Ranger. Also, I have not decided who is going to get One for All. That's also something you guys can vote for down in the comment section below. And who you vote for can greatly change the story. So keep that in mind as well when you're voting. But anyway, that's going to be the upload schedule and everything for Power Core Productions and Podcastings this week and next. So stay tuned for that and everything else that is to come. What If Tanjiro Had Venom is going to be coming out at midnight tonight. That's going to be part 3. And part 2 of What If Deku Was a Power Ranger is going to be coming out tomorrow afternoon as well to wrap up the upload schedule for this week. And then next week, we're going to be doing alternating days from Monday to Saturday. So stay tuned for that and all the content that is to come now and in the future. But anyway, that's going to do it. Let's get into the video. What If Deku Was a Power Ranger, Part 1. Enjoy. Part 1. When we last left off, Deku and Bakugo's worlds would have now completely have changed, sending them down a new and unforeseen path. Having discovered the injured and beaten Alpha 5 robot that somehow found its way to their universe and dimension, Bakugo and Deku now took on the responsibilities of helping the young robot by becoming the new Power Rangers. Deku taking the Dragon Coin and becoming the Green Ranger, while Bakugo would take the Red Power Coin of the Tyrannosaurus and becoming the Red Ranger respectively. The two now found themselves in a new and unseen circumstance. Not just becoming heroes in their own world, but preparing themselves for whatever threats could be coming, either now or in the future. If things weren't even more unpredictable, it was also the fact that Deku had somehow received a quirk of his own. While this were unexplainable to many others, including his own doctor, when Deku was sent back by his mother after revealing his new fire-like quirk. The doctor then revealed that some children were often late bloomers, and that maybe Deku's way of manifesting his quirk was just the issue. However, for Deku and the few who knew, the real source of his newfound powers came from his body coming into contact with the morphing grid. Alpha had deduced that a human body in this world were a lot different than the humans from the world he had come from, as the humans from his universe were relatively simple, and in his timeline, no quirks or things of that nature existed. Although there were some who had extraordinary powers on their own, who also went on to become Power Rangers, such as the humans from KO-35, who had strange and supernatural abilities of their own. One that we would go on to know as being Andros of the Space Power Rangers. And within the history of Power Rangers itself, Alpha would then explain that Deku's body coming into contact with the morphing grid most likely evolutionized the dormant cells that were within his body, deducing that the humans in this world who were born quirkless were merely born with a recessive quirk gene, and that much like a car that needs a jump start, the recessive cells needed a powerful source of energy to help jumpstart and boost them to the forefront, thus revealing the quirk. When Deku morphed for the first time, his body and those residual cells came into contact with something as powerful as the morphing grid and brought them to the forefront, manifesting them in a quirk. And what was more is that Deku and Bakugo, even in their Ranger forms, could still use their quirks rather effectively. In fact, their quirks seemed to be a lot more stronger and could be used without any form of drawback. Of course, that wasn't inherently true, after all. With enough stress and strain on the body, even the Rangers could have their limits. But it was just that within their Ranger form, Bakugo didn't have to worry too much about the drawbacks of using his explosive quirk. Although, if he wasn't careful, he could blow himself out of the form. The same thing with Deku, as even with his abilities to manifest and control flame, if he overdid it too much, he could burn himself out, and thus burn himself out of his morphed state as well. The two of them making very sure to keep this in mind as they continue to practice and hone their abilities. On top of their quirk training, Alpha would also give them history lessons about the power coins themselves, telling them stories about Zordon of Altar, as well as the escapades of the original Power Rangers. When Deku would ask ultimately how things got to the way they were, Alpha, with a heavy sigh, would explain the events that changed everything. In his timeline, the Rangers were doing battle with their known enemy, that being the Green Ranger. Deku being a bit surprised that the power coin he had was used by someone that was evil. However, Alpha would explain that the power coin was originally meant for good, and that it had merely been stolen by their enemy, Rita Repulsa, and used for evil. But the power coin could always be used for good, but it always depended on the will of the user. Anyway, during their fight, the Red Ranger was able to free the Green Ranger from Rita's spell and control, and made the offer to him to join the Rangers in the fight for good. However, the ranger known as Tommy Oliver would simply leave, going into hiding and running away from the other rangers, trying to come to a decision on his own. Being seduced by Rita Repulsa once again, instead by her cunning words and not by spells and magic, he would willingly join her side and lead her forces, soon conquering most of the Earth and eventually overthrowing the Rangers. During the Rangers' last stand, the Red Ranger, known as Jason, was attempting to use the newly forged dragon coin that had been converted into the White Tiger coin in an attempt to combat Rita's forces. However, the base was stormed and the process was halted, and the White Tiger coin was stolen. Merging the powers of the White Tiger and the Green Dragon, a new coin was then forged, and thus the powerful Lord Draken came into existence, eventually sending the Rangers underground and hiding with the Resistance, as they would attempt to fight off the evil Lord Draken. However, sadly, one by one, the Rangers would be hunted down and killed, eventually leading to the situation that they were in now. Alpha being the one that was sent away with the 7 original power coins to find new Rangers who could one day rise up and stop Lord Draken, as they were aware that he would not just stop with his multiverse, but rather, Draken had been preparing for a conquest of every multiverse, of every universe where the Power Rangers existed, and maybe some that didn't. Unknown to the two boys, Lord Draken was still in his conquest, recently returning from the year 3000, as he had just defeated a version of the SPD Rangers. As Draken continued in his conquest, a day never went by when he did not think of that day. The day when the 7 power coins from his universe were sent off into another dimension altogether. Even if he conquered every dimension within the multiverse, he would not rest until those 7 coins were back in his possession. As he would send out his scouts to go and see if they could find any of the power coins, he had modified them, having learned to use spells and charms from Rita Repulsa before overthrowing her. He had converted her petty patrolmen into scouts, arming them with dimensional collars. They would travel across the multiverse in search for the power coins whenever possible, and come back with a report, if they came back at all. Lord Draken had sent out his scouts in many different areas, and soon they would be descending upon a new target. In the meantime, it was the final year of middle school, and Bakugo and Deku had all but set their sights on going to UA. Bakugo now being even more confident, having the powers of a Power Ranger on top of his own quirk, he felt as though his rise to #1 hero would be all but simple, although Deku would always be there to challenge him, annoying him nonetheless, but he did begrudgingly accept Deku. At the very least, he wasn't quirkless, and he could hold his own in a fight, although Bakugo still always had the edge whenever they trained from time to time, since he had his quirk longer and knew how to use it more properly. And for the most part, the only thing Deku were good at were throwing fireballs or shooting off smaller fiery explosions. They were decent, but he still had a long ways to go before he were ready to become a pro. As it was the final day of school, the teacher would then congratulate everyone on completing their middle school course, and taking note that many of them wanted to go into the hero world, remarking that 2 of their students had applied to UA, that being Deku and Bakugo. Bakugo remarking that those extras would only get in his way, and that the only one here who was even close to catching him would be Deku, but even then the gap between them was rather large. Deku shyly just remarking that he wanted to do his best. The others in the class would have learned of Deku's quirk. However, their role as being a Power Ranger was something that both Deku and Bakugo kept secret for obvious reasons. As class was over, Bakugo would walk over to Deku's desk, asking if he wanted to go hang out at the arcade with him and some of their other friends. Deku stating that he had to go home as there were some things that he and Alpha had been working on, but that he would meet him this weekend at the beach if he were still going to show up. Bakugo simply scoffing and stating that he knew he'd be there, and telling that dumb nerd to not be late. As Deku would take this into consideration, he would put his books away before heading home, deciding to take a shortcut as he would walk under an underpass. Unknown to him though, he would soon be met by his first formal villain. As Deku would make his way under the bridge, from under the sewers, a green sludge would start to emerge. Deku, not paying much attention, would be caught off guard as the green sludge would fly into the air, morphing into some sort of sludge villain, who had now set his sights on taking over Izuku's body. Izuku would be very nervous and terrified at the prospect, as he would back away and try to outrun the sludge monster, although it would prove to be futile. Eventually deciding that he would have no choice, Deku would put both his hands together, summoning a torrent of fire before blasting the green flame straight at the sludge villain, burning it through the center as it would yell out in smoldering pain. As the sludge villain was now farther away, Deku would wonder if now were the time to morph, if he could even do so without getting into too much trouble. Of course, before he had time to think of a proper response, the sludge villain would be on the attack once again, now wrapping itself around Deku's arms and legs, as Deku tried his best to shoot a flame at it. However, one of his hands would already be enveloped by the sludge villain. With his left hand being free, he would reach into his back pocket, as he didn't have a proper belt to hold his morpher. He would pull his morpher out and under his mumbled breath would yell out, "Dragon Sword!" Eventually being emitted in a green aura, Deku would then morph into his Green Ranger uniform. Now with a lot more strength and endurance, he would be able to push away at the sludge villain, flying into the air before landing not so gracefully on his feet. Getting ready for the fight, the sludge villain would be shocked, seeing that the boy had a hero costume of some sorts, although he seemed too young to be a hero. But none the matter, he would still go after his target, as Deku would pull out his dragon dagger, before throwing a slash, emitting a green energy that would blast away at the sludge villain, sending it flying a few feet. Deku, now moving on the offensive, would start to use his flame quirk, creating a wall of fire around the sludge villain to keep it in place, not allowing it to escape or go anywhere else. As Deku wondered if there were any way he could trap it, he would see a couple of empty bottles on the ground. As he would run over to try to grab a few of them to see if he could somehow contain the sludge villain, the fire would begin to die down just enough for the sludge villain to escape, launching itself at Deku once again, binding around Deku's arm as he would try to rip away at the sludge villain as best he could, pushing it back once again as he would hold out one of the bottles. Of course, he needed to incapacitate the sludge villain, but he didn't know if he had an attack that could do so. Of course, he could bombard it with fire, but that might kill him, and killing wasn't what a hero was supposed to do. As he tried to think of a way to incapacitate without killing the sludge villain, from a distance, a loud ringing voice could be heard in the sky. "Texas? Smash!" In a large gust of wind, the sludge villain would be smacked against the ground, reducing itself to nothing but a lifeless goo. As Deku turned to see where that large attack had come from, he would be left in shock, as standing in front of him would be none other than Japan's #1 hero, the powerful and heroic All Might. As Deku would be left stammering and in awe, All Might would turn to see the young hero standing in front of him, as he didn't recognize the young hero at all, thinking that he must have been new or someone from the area. All Might would congratulate him on holding the sludge villain at bay, and that there was no need to worry because now he were here. As he would look to see if there were any way he could contain and hold it in place, Deku would offer to put it in the bottles that he were carrying. All Might thanking the boy for his help, as the two of them would get to work, putting away the sludge villain into two separate bottles, locking on the caps tight before All Might would go to send it straight to the police station. Before leaving though, Deku would demorph and run up to All Might, asking him if he could get an autograph. However, before he even had time to finish, All Might would explain that he had already done so, stating that he had done a good job, but he didn't know if he were a pro hero or not. Deku explaining that he wasn't, and holding his head down a bit in shame, stating that he didn't mean to cause trouble, but he were being attacked and he had no choice in the matter. All Might nodding his head in understanding, stating that if it were in self-defense then it were fine, but that he should try to be more careful next time. He would also want to ask the young boy about how it was that his suit came and went the way that it did, that were rather odd, something he had never seen before. Deku, not knowing if he could tell All Might his secret just yet, he would decide to keep it to himself and say that it was really nothing, honestly, and that it was just something that he could do, something akin to his quirk, that's all. All Might, being a bit perplexed at this, would decide to let it go since the villain had been taken care of and everything was fine. However, before he would take off, Deku would want to ask him one last question. He would ask him if he could one day be a hero as good as him with the power that he had. All Might would simply turn back to the young boy, giving him a thumbs up and saying that with moves like that, he would make a splendid hero someday. He just had to learn how to train and control that fire, and learn how to make some better split-second decisions, that's all. Things that he would gain with experience and in time. Now needing to take off in a hurry, All Might would bid the boy farewell before jumping into the air and flying off in the sky, leaving Deku even more enamored and happy than ever before, as he now looked forward to the upcoming exams, preparing himself for everything that was to come. Later on that day, Deku would call Bakugo and tell him everything that happened. Bakugo being a bit stunned, but not really believing Deku at all. Even though he didn't have a reason to lie, he had a hard time believing everything he said. But nonetheless, Deku would still be excited for everything that were to come, and stating that these next 10 months they were going to need to work really hard if they were going to be ready for the UA entrance exams. Bakugo remarking that Deku were going to have to learn to get a better control of that quirk of his if he were going to stand a chance. Meanwhile, Alpha would be working on his new invention. First and foremost, he had decided to leave his old body that was rather large and clunky and couldn't really do much, opting instead to rebuild himself, with the aid of Bakugo and Deku of course, pointing and having them assist him in any way that they could. He would instead build his new body and now be known as Alpha 6. The body would be a lot smaller while retaining his regular large-sized head. Instead, the body would now move with the ability to transform from robot into flying drone, which was basically just his head that was able to fly in the air and spin and move, deciding that this would be a lot more optimal and a lot less conspicuous. Deku would even come up with the idea for Alpha to be able to transform into his backpack essentially. Alpha liking the idea since it meant that he could stay close to Deku at all times. With a little ingenuity and a lot of work, eventually Deku would have converted Alpha into his new drone form. A drone that can convert into a robot as well as turn into his backpack that he could carry with him at all times. Inside of his compartment, Alpha always made sure to carry the extra morphers and the other power coins, never knowing when they would find a new candidate and have to initiate them into the group as well. With all that out of the way, Deku would meet with Bakugo at the beach to unveil the new invention that Alpha had made for them. They had looked like regular watches, but Alpha explained that they were actually communicators, stating that Zordon had the old Rangers have them, and it only made sense that this team of Rangers would have communicators as well. Giving one to Bakugo and Deku keeping one himself, he would state that this would be a way for them to keep in contact with one another without having to use their phones, essentially because you never knew when you would have to discuss Ranger business and you wanted to keep it private. Bakugo being on board with the idea, the two boys would then get to work, as they now only had 10 months until the entrance exams, and Deku still had a lot of work in using that new quirk of his. For the next 10 months, Deku and Bakugo would practice with getting Deku up to speed on using his quirk, building his muscles and building his stamina and his strength as best they could. The two boys would train together, do target practice together, and even spar together on the beach. Unknowingly, all of their explosions and large incinerating fire blasts cleared away a lot of the debris unexpectedly. Eventually, without the two boys even noticing, they had managed to incinerate almost all of the trash on the beach, making it clear for people to use again. Around the 7-month period, as a skinny man were walking by, he would see that the beach had been entirely clear, wondering how that could have possibly have happened. He would then happen to look down at the shore that early morning as he would see two boys fervently at work sparring with one another. The young blonde boy shooting off massive explosions, while there would be a young green-haired boy that he had recognized from before, who were shooting off green fire blasts of his own. As the two boys went at it, the skinny man would walk towards them, introducing himself and asking what they were doing here. As the two boys would stop what they were doing, Bakugo wondering who the skinny old man was, and Deku respectfully bowing, stating that they were just trying to get some training in, as they had some time before the UA entrance exams. The skinny man would introduce himself as Toshinara, stating that he too were going to be attending UA to watch the entrance exams, and that while he did so, he would ask the boys if they had permission to use their quirks here. The two boys would look down rather shyly as they didn't actually have a permit. They had just been practicing here since no one ever came along because of all the trash. But then they would have to stop and look around and realize that there was no trash. All the trash had been blown away unexpectedly. The skinny man would simply smile before telling the boys that even though what they were doing were fine and all, they had to make sure to do things the proper way. He would then explain that he were good friends with some of the people at UA and he thinks he knows a person that could help them out, telling them to meet back here at the beach tomorrow. As the two boys would do so, unexpectedly, they would be greeted by none other than the #1 hero himself, All Might. The two boys being left speechless and in awe, as All Might would introduce himself once again to young Izuku Midoriya, as well as introducing himself to Katsuki Bakugo, the two boys happy to actually meet their hero. All Might would then explain to the young boys that he had gotten word from an old friend of his that the two boys needed some training in getting up to par, and thankfully, since he had gotten a proper permit from the city to use their quirks on the beach, he was going to be more than interested in training the two boys and preparing them for the exams. The two boys being more than eager to take up on All Might's proposition, All Might would then begin training the young boys, drilling them and coaching them to increase their strength, their stamina, and their cardio, working the boys out non-stop for the next 3 months until the exams would come. The main focus would be on helping Deku get a proper mastery over his flame quirk, eventually getting to the point where he could control the output of it as well as the intensity and the heat. It wasn't complete mastery, but he had definitely made vast improvements. And Bakugo managed to get stronger as well, just from receiving training from the number one hero. Eventually, the day before the exams would arrive, and All Might would congratulate them on how far they had come, wishing them good luck for the exams in the next morning. As Bakugo and Deku would bow to All Might, thanking him for his help, the number one hero would then leave off into the distance, as the two boys were now excited for what were to come the next day. As the next morning would arrive, both Deku and Bakugo would walk to the UA together, catching the train and preparing themselves for what were to come. With their communicators on deck, as well as their training clothes for the exam, the two boys had studied and trained, both physically and mentally, and they were as ready as they could be. As Bakugo would tell Deku not to make a fool of himself, Deku would state that he had put in a lot of work not to embarrass himself this time around. However, just as he was saying those words, he would trip on a step. Bakugo seeing this and already face-palming, thinking that Deku were going to knock himself out before the test even started. As Deku started to fall to the ground, thinking that he were just going to die here, he would soon find himself floating just inches off the ground in the air. Before eventually pulling himself back up, he would turn to see a young girl with short brown hair and with smiling pink cheeks. The girl would introduce herself as Ochako Uraraka, and she would state that she saw him falling and she just wanted to help him out so that he didn't hurt himself. Deku thanking the girl immensely for what she had done, as she would wish him good luck as they would all walk inside to take part in the UA entrance exams. The written part of the exam would go rather easily, as Deku and Bakugo had studied rather well, and they were each prepared. Deku getting an 80% out of 100, and Bakugo scoring an 85 out of 100. The two boys having done excellently well, and now it was time for the physical part of the exam. Knowing that things were going to get physical, Alpha had made it clear to the boys that when it came to things like training, as long as they were allowed to properly use their powers, unless stated otherwise, they were allowed to use their morphers. Of course, Deku wondered if that would really help them or would defeat the purpose of them getting into UA in the first place. However, Bakugo would remark that if they were going to go all out, they had to see what they could truly do and push their limits. Of course, the boys would train in their morph form, but just going up against one another, they already knew what the other one was capable of. But now was the time for them to see the fruits of their labor, as when they were training with All Might, they never revealed their morphers to him, so they never really got a chance to see how much stronger they had become. While Deku were a bit nervous at this, he would decide how bad could it be. Both Deku and Bakugo stating that if they were going to go all out, they might as well. As they made their way to their respective entrances for the next exam, they would all be greeted by the hero Present Might, as he would explain to them the rules of this exam, that they would be going into an urban district area where they would have to battle different robots that would be worth different points. There would be the 1-pointers, the 2-pointers, and the 3-pointers. And finally, there would be the 4-point robot, who would provide 0 points. But it was really dangerous, so they might want to watch out for that. As everyone lined up at the entrance line, Deku seeing the girl from earlier and wanting to go say hi, he would then be stopped by a taller boy with glasses, admonishing him for distracting someone else before they would get started for the exam. Deku just lamenting at this and keeping to himself. As everyone were preparing for the entrance exam to begin, the doors would simply open as Present Might would just yell out to everyone that in a real life situation you don't get a countdown and that they should just go. Everyone just running out ahead of everyone else, as Deku would find himself being a bit trampled on before rushing out to face the others. As they would run, they would see a city overflowing with robots of different shapes and sizes. With Deku taking a deep breath, he would reach into his back pocket. In the other area, Bakugo would do the same. The two boys getting into a stance as the cameras from the observation room would zoom in closely to see what the two boys were up to. With a loud cry from the two different arenas, both Bakugo and Deku would begin to morph, as the call for the Dragon Zord and Tyrannosaurus would echo loudly, and in a flash of green and red, the Green and Red Ranger would now emerge. Welcome everyone to the brief intermission for What If Deku Was a Power Ranger? Now for this intermission, we're not going to take too long, but I do want to explain how Deku's powers work and a brief summary for how the Power Ranger powers will work in My Hero Academia. Now, some of you are going to wonder, why does Deku have a quirk? Shouldn't Deku remain quirkless? Now, the answer to that is yes, and in a lot of Power Ranger What If Deku Was a Power Ranger What Ifs, Deku often is quirkless, he just has the Power Ranger powers. But I wanted to change that on its head just a little bit, simply because the morphing grid is an unknown entity all in of itself, and depending on who you have writing or making the story, the morphing grid can be and do just about anything you want it to do. So I like the concept of the residual quirk, or what I would like to call a recessive quirk gene. Just like humans in the real world, we all have recessive genes in our body. Say you have a parent with red hair and you have a parent with black hair. If black hair is the dominant gene, more often than not, a child is going to have black hair. Although sometimes they might have red hair. So in this what if, I call quirk recessive genes basically being a situation where, like in My Hero Academia, 80% of the world can use quirks, meaning that the quirk in and of itself is the dominant gene. Meanwhile, the recessive quirk is basically having the quirk potential, but it's so recessive that it can't be accessed. This concept was also used in the X-Men series, especially in the X-Men 2 movie, where it was revealed by Iceman that his parents didn't actually have the mutation power, but that just because his parents didn't have it, it didn't mean that Bobby couldn't become a mutant, as he did, becoming Iceman. And the other mutants would also reveal that that gene resides in the males, so it was possible that even if you have a human who did not have a X gene and was not a mutant in and of themselves, it didn't mean that they couldn't have children that wouldn't have a mutant gene. So similar, because quirks and mutation in X-Men are kind of the same thing in a lot of ways. So that was really the idea that I came up with. And I decided if we're going to use the morphing grid, why not use it in that way? Have it be a tool that could be used for good and for evil, since the morphing grid has the capability of morphing someone into something even greater than before. So I like the idea that if a human who does not have a quirk comes into contact with the morphing grid via morphing into a Power Ranger or by some other means, then it could bring out their inner powers that would otherwise remain dormant. And for Deku, since his father was a fire breather and his mother can levitate small objects, I believe the merging of the two quirks would create some type of fire-bending, fire-moving sort of quirk. So for Deku, I gave him pyrokinesis, or essentially fire-bending. And if you've seen the show Avatar: The Last Airbender, you're familiar with fire-bending and what it can do. So basically, anything that a firebender can do in Avatar: The Last Airbender, that's what Deku can do now. Also, quirks being used with the Ranger powers. That's also not a new concept, as in the world of Power Rangers, you do have Ranger teams that have auxiliary powers separate from the main Power Ranger suits. Just a few seasons to go, for example, you have In Space with the In Space Red Ranger, who has telekinesis, who can use that power while also being a Ranger. You also have ranger teams like Ninja Storm who have the ability to control elements, and they can use that power with or without the Power Ranger powers. You have Mystic Force who are sorcerers who could use magic and sorcery with or without the ranger powers. You also have SPD, a show that I feel kind of takes the ideas of quirks similar to how I'm doing now, basically exactly how I'm doing, when you have the Space Patrol Delta Power Rangers who had the civilian powers. The Red Ranger who had the ability to walk through walls, the Yellow Ranger who could make clones of herself, the Pink Ranger who could basically absorb any material, kind of like Absorption Man. You had the Green Ranger who could read the emotions of others. You had the Blue Ranger who could create force fields, and so on and so forth. And then you also have Dino Thunder and the Dino Thunder Rangers who had their civilian powers, with the Red Ranger having super speed, the Yellow Ranger having sonic scream, Blue Ranger having tough dino skin, and Tommy Oliver, coincidentally, who had the ability to turn invisible. So you always had civilian powers that could work along with the Ranger powers. So that's basically the similarities for what I'm going for with this series. The idea being that yes, they have the Power Ranger powers that give them an extra boost in power, but they also have their civilian powers, or as we have in My Hero Academia, quirks, so that they can fall back on. So that's kind of the idea for what I'm going for here, and it's why I gave Deku a quirk also. And also, as for the video that's going, please continue to vote for who you want to get certain powers. There are still candidates for One for All, because One for All has not been passed down yet in this timeline, as you can see from the story so far. So you do have candidates for people who could potentially get One for All, and depending on who you pick, it can send the story in a different direction altogether. Also, don't forget, even though I'm pretty sure you can already tell who's going to get what coins, there still has not been a candidate for the White Tiger coin power. So that's also another candidate as well, so keep that in mind as the story goes forward. But anyway, that was just a brief explanation for the power scaling and how it's going to work in the series as well, and also why Deku has a quirk in this What If story. So I hope it makes sense and clears things up for the story now and going forward. But anyway, without further ado, we're going to get back into the story, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the continuation. What happened next would shock many of the teachers and staff in attendance. As blurs of green and red flash along their screens, Deku, with the powers of the dragon, using his dragon dagger along with his immense flames, would slash and blow through many of the robots, racking up many hero points, as well as Bakugo, now using the power sword at his disposal in one hand and his explosions in the other, hacking away and blowing through at his robots respectively. The two earning the most out of anyone in attendance, breaking new records and new ground altogether. As All Might sat in attendance, he would then recognize that boy from before, Deku, or Izuku as he were called, were the hero, and this was what he was capable of. Wondering now if there were more to this boy than what met the eye, as well as taking an intrigue in young Bakugo, as he too had this power. The teachers would now look on in amazement and also in a bit of curiosity, wondering where these boys got this type of power from. Where had they come from? The president of the school, or the Principal Nezu, would look to All Might, as All Might would explain that those were two boys that he had actually been training these last few months, but that he didn't know they were capable of this. The president now being more intrigued, he would tell All Might that after today, they should meet with the young boys, as there were probably more to the situation than met the eye, and being rather vigilant of the matter, they would want to make sure to keep things on the up and up. But still, if they were going to gauge what they could do, now was the good time for them to do so. As Deku would take a break to catch his breath, as he had been working overtime using his quirk to the max, wondering if he had racked up enough points. The ground would start to shake and to rumble, as from around the corner, a large 0-point robot had now emerged. As it made its way around to everyone, Deku would start to wonder if this were a situation that called for him to use the Dragon Zord, although he would remember that Alpha hadn't unlocked that function yet, as he didn't want the boys using their Megazords just yet, unless the situation actually called for it. After all, if you're not fighting a giant monster, or doing something that requires giant proportions, what do you really need a giant robot for? Although now would have been a good time to have one. As everyone would start to run and Deku would be preparing to move out of the way himself, he would turn to see someone yelling for help. A young girl whose leg was trapped under debris. As Deku recognized the girl from before, Ochako Uraraka, without hesitation he would rush to her side. Moving over to the debris, using his extra ranger strength, he would be able to lift up the debris just enough for Ochako to crawl out, picking her up instantly and rushing her to safety, before turning back to face the giant zero-pointer robot. As he looked up to face it, there was something within him, wanting to see if he could challenge himself. He wanted to see just how far he had come. Once Uraraka was out of the way and everyone else were continuing their run, Deku would turn back to the zero-pointer robot. With Dragon Dagger in hand and emitting a green flame all around him, he would focus all of his energy into his feet. Then, shooting himself into the air, almost as if he had green flame jets, Deku would start to propel himself forward at the giant robot, eventually moving and running up its arm, hacking and slicing away at the joints and at the hydraulic pumps and everything that connected the robot's servers, as he moved up to the robot's arm and eventually up to its face. Deku, now charging all the power that he had stored up within him, everything that his quirk could muster. He would then hold out both his hands together before shooting out a giant green inferno blast, shooting the robot clear in the face and blowing its head off completely, as it would disintegrate and fall to the ground. As Deku did so while hovering in the air, he would soon find himself beginning to fall himself, wondering if there were any way that he could slow down the fall, feeling highly drained and exhausted from having overused his quirk. Deku would then focus his power once again. Using whatever strength he had left in his feet, he would then emit just enough of a flame to cushion the blow. Before falling, he would basically hover in the air, just long enough to stop his momentum before he would fall to the ground, demorphing and completely exhausted, barely able to lift his arms and legs, extremely tired, but still proud of his accomplishment. Knowing that he had gotten probably just enough points to pass, he would decide to rest and let the exams finish up, as soon the bell would ring and the entrance exams would officially be over. With the entrance exams now at its end, after getting some rest, Deku and Bakugo would then make their way home, as now there was nothing left to do except wait for the final results. 3 weeks would pass and neither boy would have gotten their letter in the mail, even though they probably should have been here by now. Instead, the two boys would be given a phone call, explaining that they were going to need to come to the school to get their exams, as well as other matters that needed to be discussed. Both Deku and Bakugo would be a bit perplexed at this, but wouldn't think none the wiser, as the two boys would hop on the train and soon find themselves at UA, making their way through the halls until eventually arriving at the room for their meeting, which was the principal's office. They would be greeted by the young and energetic Principal Nezu, as well as a few other staff members who were there. A man who looked to be dead-eyed with the scarf around his neck, and to their surprise, they would see All Might was there as well. The two boys left in shock as Deku would sit down in his assigned seat, Bakugo as well, as he would take off his Alpha backpack and sit it at his side. Always bringing Alpha along, as you never know when you need a helping hand. As the two boys sat, Principal Nezu would congratulate them on scoring first and second place respectively. Bakugo, who would have scored a record high 140 points, that being via villain points, while Deku would have come in second, scoring 120, as he had gotten 80 in the villain points, but also would have gotten his extra points via rescue points for his saving of Ochako Uraraka, that counting to his final score of 120. As the two boys would be happy with themselves and how far they had come, the principal would then turn to a more serious tone, as he had to ask the two boys what exactly were their powers and where had they come from. The two boys would now look at one another in a bit of shock and in fear, not sure that the principal were actually going to ask them such a question. As the two boys were rather worried to speak, All Might would then step forward. He would tell them that they weren't in trouble at all, but that it was obvious that whatever they had, it was something that wasn't quite normal, and it would be in everyone's interest if at least those who were higher up knew what were going on. As Deku would look at them, he would then say shyly that even if he told them the truth, they probably wouldn't believe a word he was saying. With everyone looking in the room, All Might would then state that he would want to reveal something to the boys, Nezu wondering if that were really the right move, and the sleepy-eyed teacher as well. However, All Might would explain that if they couldn't show that they trusted the boys, then they weren't going to get anywhere, and he had trust in them. As All Might would stand in front of them, in a puff of smoke would appear the skinny man from before, shocking the two boys as it was Toshinera, the man that they had met at the beach that day. Now seeing that All Might actually was in this form, the two boys would have many questions, and All Might would spend his time answering them, as he would have no choice but to tell them his secret, the story of One for All, as well as All for One, the history of the quirk that was passed down from user to user, his battle 5 years ago, and how now he can only do 3 hours of hero work a day. After the boys' questions were answered, now it would be their turn to talk. As Deku and Bakugo looked at each other one more time, Deku would take a deep breath before picking up his backpack, as it would start to glow and Alpha's voice would now be heard in the room. Deku would tell him that it would be okay, and that it was best if they could trust the number one hero to help them. With a bit of a silence, the backpack would then morph into a tiny robot, shocking everyone. Alpha would then introduce himself to everyone else in the room, shocking All Might and the two teachers, as they had no idea Deku carried around a small robot. Alpha would then get in the middle of the room, as he would play the hologram projection that he had shown the two boys, leaving everyone in silence. All Might being shocked to see something so violent and revile. The other teachers as well, not knowing that something this serious could actually be happening, that this robot came from another dimension, another universe, and more so that these two boys had been chosen to become these Power Rangers. All Might couldn't help but feel very close to the situation, kind of seeing the power of these Power Rangers similar to One for All, as it was a power that was passed down. As the two boys would now inject their own 2 cents after the video was over, Deku would explain that there were 7 power coins that he and Bakugo each had one, and that they still had to find 5 more candidates. Although where they were going to find them would be rather difficult. He would explain that Alpha carried all of those power coins with him at all times, Deku remarking that this was the way that he could keep them safe, as he always wanted to keep them close by. Telling the teachers this and everything else. Now, decisions had to be made. Of course, it wasn't that they didn't trust the 2 kids, they did. But still, to know that Deku were carrying around something that dangerous and powerful at all times, it just didn't sit entirely well. When deciding if the 2 boys should be allowed to keep their power coins, however, All Might would stick up to their defense, stating that they had proven themselves in their battle training, that they proved they could handle the power. Alpha will also interject and state that once someone bound with the power coins, they could only work with that user, unless of course that user were killed. So, unless Deku or Bakugo were killed in battle, the power coins would only work and morph whenever they used their morphers. So in that way, they had that protection. However, the same cannot be said for the other 5 power coins. As Nezuko would ponder all this information, it would then be decided that it would be in the best interest of everyone if Alpha were to stay here at UA. Of course, Deku would be surprised at this news, as he felt as though if anyone should be kept close to him, it should be Alpha. After all, they had become such friends and they had been together through so much. However, Nezuko would want to point out that in all seriousness, Deku were carrying something that were extremely dangerous and powerful. And if word ever got out about these powers, say to villains or something along those lines, he would always be a target. At the very least, if Alpha were at UA, he would always be safe, and he would have 24-hour protection. Plus, Deku could visit Alpha as much and as often as he liked, and the teachers wouldn't trust Alpha to be a lookout for both Deku and Bakugo. After all, he were the only one in this universe who was versed in these powers, and the boys were going to need his help. All Might would also state that he wanted to stick close with the 2 young heroes and help them train. As for the sleepy-eyed teacher in the background, he would state that since they were going to be in his homeroom, he would be keeping a close eye on them as well, and that he would make sure that they stayed safe. With everyone agreeing and in unison, it would be made official that Alpha would stay on campus along with the power coins, and that the teachers would work to find suitable candidates to become Rangers. As Aizawa would ponder this himself, he would ask if he could pick out the candidates himself. They would wonder why he would want to do so, and he would remark that since he was going to be in charge of Class 1A, he felt as though they would have the best possible candidates. As Alpha would ponder this, he would state that that would be fine, although finding someone who could use the White Tiger coin would be even more difficult, as that coin was said to be the most powerful, if not a bit more unstable than the others, at least in the sense that it would require someone with immense power themselves to be able to wield. They would ask All Might if he would want to become a Ranger. However, All Might would state that since he had one for all, and there was no telling how that could possibly affect the power coin, he would decide to hold off for now, explaining that he were looking for a candidate to pass on his quirk to as well. So now it was a bit of a race amongst everyone involved, to find 5 more candidates to become Rangers, and All Might finding a candidate for One for All. With everything decided, the 2 boys would then head home, Deku helping Alpha get situated as he would be given a special room on campus, allowing him to be hidden safely, and he would be allowed to meet and hang with Deku whenever he could, or whenever Deku had a question that needed solving. However, before Deku would leave, Alpha would give him one last thing. It would be a special communicator so that the two of them could stay linked at all times. That being that Alpha could now communicate to both Deku and Bakugo, even if he weren't next to them, so they would always have information whenever they needed it. As the two boys would thank Alpha, they would then head home, as in less than a week's time, Class 1A would meet for the first time. Soon a week would pass, and the semester would now begin. As Deku and Bakugo made their way to Class 1A, they would soon be greeted by the girl that Deku had saved earlier, Ochako Uraraka. As they made their way into the room, they would also be greeted by a tall boy with glasses, his name being Tenya Ida. As the young boy would introduce himself to the others, Bakugo would simply ignore him and make his way to his desk, putting his feet on them and relaxing, as Ida would then chastise him for disrespecting the furniture, as Deku and Uraraka simply tried to wonder if this were the class for heroes. As then, if things couldn't get even more stranger, they would see a large knapsack on the floor, Deku wondering who it could be before the knapsack would slowly rise, and they would look to see that it was a man with long shaggy hair, Deku recognizing him as the teacher from before, as he would look up, rather dead expression than looking as if he just didn't get enough sleep. You guys, this is not going to do. If you're going to be this loud, I'll expel all of you right now. Catching everyone's attention as they would now become silent. He would just slowly get up from his sleeping bag and roll it up before having a bottle of juice, telling them to get into their gym uniforms and to meet him outside, as they were going to get to work. The young Uraraka would ask if they were going to go to orientation like everyone else, but the teacher would simply explain that in his class he made the rules, and if they were going to be heroes, then they didn't need to worry themselves about something like orientation. Eventually heading to the back and grabbing their respective UA gym uniforms, everyone would make their way outside, lined up all together. All 20 students looking on in amazement and in ecstatic, as they were happy that they were now taking their first steps forward in becoming heroes. As Aizawa would look to the crowd, he would state that the two that got the highest scores were Bakugo and Izuku Midoriya, the two boys looking very happy with themselves. Bakugo would step up first, as called by Aizawa, who would tell him that the first thing they were going to do is test their quirk-like abilities, as it was against the law for them to use their quirks outside of quirk jurisdicted situations, or unless they had a hero license. As Bakugo would be given the first chance, he would be told to throw that tethered ball, that it would have a tracker, and that on his phone he would reveal the score that he got, telling Bakugo that in order to do so, he should use his quirk. As Bakugo would step forward, he would look back to Deku and say to him that this was how the number one hero got into action. Taking his stance within the circle, Bakugo would prepare an explosion within his hand. Throwing the ball and setting off the explosion at the same time, the ball would soar high into the air, looking as if it were breaking the sound barrier. As Aizawa would pull out his phone to see the score, he would reveal it to everyone, showing that Bakugo got a distance of 705.2 meters. Everyone being impressed with how far he had managed to get it, they also looked on in anticipation, some remarking that this were going to be really fun. It was at that word though, fun, that Aizawa decided that he were going to have some fun of his own. As everyone were looking on in excitement, thinking that they were finally going to get to use their quirks, their excitement would quickly come to a screeching halt as Aizawa would then throw out the caveat that whoever got the lowest score that day was going to be expelled immediately. This catching everyone's attention, now knowing that they had to try harder. Among the crowd, many would say that it were unfair, stating that they already worked so hard just to get here. However, Aizawa would simply look at them with a stern face, stating that life wasn't fair, villains aren't fair, natural disasters aren't fair. Nothing that they will ever experience in life is ever going to be fair. But if they're going to be real heroes, then they have to combat that unfairness. With no one else daring to talk back, they now knew that in this situation, they would have to give it their all. Among most of them, Deku would find many of the exercises not to be all that hard, although his quirk would give him a bit of a boost in a few areas, mainly due to speed or with power. However, when it came to things like grip strength, that was something that he probably would have done a lot better on if he had used his Morpher. However, before the two boys had even gone outside, Mr. Aizawa would have spoken to the two, telling them not to use their Morphers in this situation, as he wanted to gauge how strong they were with their natural quirk alone. Although he would have a private exhibition for the two someday, just to see how strong their Morphers actually made them, so he could gauge their true power strength, although that would be for a later date and time. Among certain areas, Deku's quirk would prove to be invaluable. He would place 4th in the long distance sprint, coming behind Bakugo and Ida respectively, as they were the true speed masters. However, since Deku's quirk was in a lot of ways similar to Bakugo, albeit using fire instead of an explosion, it did allow him to increase his speed and his movements in various ways, from the sprint to the long jump, although things like the grip test were otherwise hard to speak of. Eventually, when it came to the ball throw, Deku would step forward, as Bakugo had scored the highest so far that day, with a 705.2 meters. Deku would aim to surpass that goal, although he would wonder how he could best use his quirk in this situation, as if he used too much heat, the ball might just end up incinerating before it got a good enough distance. Instead, calculating his moves correctly, he would get into a particular stance, gripping the ball in such a way. As he would do so, Aizawa and everyone else would look on at Deku as he would prepare for the ball throw. Taking it into his hand, Deku would then throw the ball into the air, spinning it so that it stood in one place, before he would jump into the air using his flame quirk to push him forward. And then, doing a spinning kick, Deku would kick the ball into the air, and at the very last second, with the heel of his shoe, he would set off a tiny burst of fire, angling it in just a way so that the ball would be sent skyrocketing into the air, eventually catching up almost to Bakugo's speed. As Bakugo had got a 705, Deku would have got a 702. Noting that he probably could have put more power into it, but that would have just destroyed the ball at an earlier distance, and he wouldn't have gotten as far as he had. Impressing everyone with the versatility of how he could use his flames, Bakugo would look on impressed, although he would still look smugly as he had gotten the farthest. And even though Deku were hanging in there decently, he was still behind him. And even if they could use their ranger powers, it would just make Bakugo all that more special. However, neither boy could prepare themselves for what was to come next, as Uraraka would give it a shot, her ball just going on until eventually the number infinity came onto the screen, shocking the two boys as Uraraka yelled out in success. Eventually, as the day went on and the quirk apprehension test had come to an end, the final scores would then be revealed. In first place would be Momo Yaoyorozu. In second place, Shoto Todoroki. In third place, Katsuki Bakugo. In fourth place, Izuku Midoriya. In fifth place, Tenya Ida. In sixth place, Fumikage Tokoyami. And so on and so forth. Deku just being happy that he had made it in the top 5. And Bakugo not being happy at the fact that he hadn't gotten even farther. Although, nonetheless, he was still impressed that he had made it to the top 3. And he had still managed to outdo Deku. Eventually, they would come down to the final student who got in last place. That student being Mineta Minoru. As they looked down, Mineta, the short boy with sticky purple balls for his hair, would look on nervously as Aizawa would stand in front of him. As everyone looked on to see if the boy were really going to be expelled, Aizawa would simply ask the boy if he intended on doing better next time. As the young boy would fervently shake his head yes, Aizawa would simply state that then that was all, and state that the tests were over and that everyone could move on. Everybody looking on with a deadpan expression, wondering if they were really going to be expelled in the first place, before Momo Yaoyorozu would step forward and state that it was a pretty obvious deception, and that he were merely trying to get them to do their best. Everyone now realizing they probably should have seen through that. Although Aizawa would quickly admit that he actually did fail all 20 of his students 1 year, and they just happened to be impressive to him. As everyone now would be in a state of confusion and in fear, everyone would pack up and prepare to leave and go home for the day. As everyone were preparing to group out and leave, Aizawa would then meet up with All Might. All Might asking if there were any good candidates to become rangers in his class. As Aizawa would remark that there actually were. 2 of them that actually stood out the most, that being the first and second place scorers of the test, Momo Yaoyorozu and Shoto Todoroki. He had also seen something impressive in that Tenya Ida, and Ochako Uraraka seemed like there was another level to her, although he wouldn't know for sure. Of course, he hadn't made the final decision, and they also did want to get inquiries from Alpha, who would be given a recording of the quirk apprehension test so that he could see if there were anyone else out in particular that he thought would be worthy of becoming a ranger. With that being said though, everyone would pack up things as they would go home for the day. Deku and Bakugo making their way to the train station when they would be stopped by Uraraka and Tenya Ida, who also wanted to walk with them. Bakugo didn't care so much, but he wouldn't object to it, as Deku would talk with his new classmates, as they would ask many questions about Deku and Bakugo's quirks, and also they would ask about their particular transformations, that green and red uniform of theirs. This would cause the 2 boys to choke a little, as they would try their best to come up with a plausible excuse for it all, stating that it was just a little fancy costume of theirs and it was nothing all that special, and that if there was more, they would tell them about it some other time. As the 2 boys kept to themselves, unknown to them, they were being watched by a group of monstrous creatures who were on the search for wherever the new Rangers were hiding. This concludes What If Deku Was a Power Ranger? Heroes of the Morphing Grid, Part 1. For all this and more, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, hit that bell for post notifications so you can stay updated on everything that is Power Core Productions and Podcastings. And stay tuned for What If Tanjiro Had Venom, Part 3, coming out tonight at midnight, as well as What If Deku Was a Power Ranger Part 2 coming out tomorrow afternoon. And stay tuned for more that is to come next week and beyond on Power Core Productions and Podcastings. But anyway, that's going to do it for the end of this video. I'm Javon Harrington with Power Core Productions and Podcastings, signing off, and I'll see you next time.